start? Fine. So I've been asked to give a lecture on cross-sectional studies. Okay, as you have noticed, as you are noticing now from this slide, what's there beside cross-sectional studies? It's equal, it's synonym to prevalence studies. As you will see that cross-sectional study design are study designs in which you are able to evaluate or to compute prevalence outcome measures. Okay, you cannot calculate from cross-sectional studies incidence, and we'll see why is this the case and exactly what do we mean by prevalence outcomes. Okay. As a matter of fact, quite often in the literature, they just describe cross-sectional studies as prevalence studies. Okay. So when you see prevalence studies, all cross-sectional, they are exactly referring exactly to the same studies. So what are we hoping to achieve by the end of this session? First, we will try to understand what is the design within cross-sectional studies, how do we conduct and what are the issues by conducting cross-sectional studies, and then towards the latter half of the session, how do we analyze a cross-sectional study. Following analysis, we are hoping always in any study, we are trying to answer a research question. Okay, so the research question is always a kind of an exposure and an outcome, or an independent variable and a dependent variable. For example, one research question could be, what is or how do men and women vary in terms of obesity? Okay, so what's the main independent variable over here? Gender. Okay, men and women. What's the outcome? Dependent variable. It is what? Obesity. So there is a research question, and we are trying now within this session to analyze this research question using the design cross-sectional study design. Later on, you will be exposed to more sophisticated study designs. This is, as a matter of fact, the simplest study design in epidemiology. Later, you will be introduced to cohort studies or follow-up studies. You will be introduced to case control studies and probably to clinical trial studies. Okay, so the basic or the simplest kind of study designs in EPI, in order to answer a simple research question as how do males and females differ by obesity, is the cross-sectional studies. So within this session, we will try to understand how do we conduct study design, cross-sectional studies, and how do we analyze cross-sectional studies. Towards the end, because we are using the study design to answer this question, we want to have a quantitative measure in the association between gender and the outcome. And we want to be able to, by the end of the study, is to say, for example, males are 2 times at higher risk to be obese than females, or vice versa. Okay? Or maybe obesity is more prevalent in the low socioeconomic status versus the high socioeconomic status. So we need to understand this kind of differential in the outcome and the prevalence of the dependent variable by the different categories of the independent variables. And hence, instead of coming with a statement just like a text, okay, that males are at higher, or males have 60%, or the prevalence of obesity among males is 60% and the prevalence of obesity in females is 30%, we need to come up with a quantitative measure, and we'll try to understand what is the basic measure of association in cross-section study. Is it the odds ratio? Is it the risk ratio? Is it the rate ratio? I'm sure we have heard about these terms, but we'll try to put these terms into context within the cross-section studies. All through, I will try to highlight to you what are the potential uses, the advantages, and the disadvantages of cross-sectional studies. It's important to understand at the outset of any session that there is no study which is totally immune from biases. ما في شيء أحسن من شيء, okay? ما في شيء, sorry, is the state of art of study design. One is better than the other for one characteristic, while the other study is better than the first one in terms of other characteristics. So we'll try to discuss with you what is the usage of the cross-sectional study design, what are the advantages, and what are the disadvantages. So, how are studies classified? They are classified based on the design, whether they are observational versus experimental. I'm sure in your high school you still remember the simple experimental study in which we were told, if you want to prove that sunlight is important for the photosynthesis of the plants, what do? Yes, we put one in the dark and one in the light, and then you compare the outcome. So what's the main exposure over here? It is light. And what's the outcome? It's the health of the photosynthesis in the plant, and this is measured indirectly by health by being, green, and so on and so forth. Well, is this an experimental study or this is an observational study? Are we just observing what's happening in the plant, or have you imposed your intervention on the plant? It's experimental. Why? Because we have imposed the intervention. Okay. Similarly, in human studies, okay, studies conducted among population and on humans, there are experimental studies and there are observation studies. In observation studies, you as an investigator, you don't intervene in the lifestyle of the individual. You just listen and observe what's happening. Okay, just see whether people are smoking or not. You just observe whether people are doing exercise or not, and you observe what is the outcome based on these characteristics. Okay, you do not intervene. If you are intervening to the extent that you say, okay, now you do, this group will do physical activity, the other group will not be doing physical activity, this becomes what? Experimental studies. Not only, so studies are not classified based only on the design, they are specified based on the analytical procedures, usually analytical procedures, meaning the sophistication of the analysis. Okay. If you are not only describing the distribution of obesity by gender, by time, by place, this is mainly you are describing, there is not kind of a rigorous hypothesis testing what are the risk factors for obesity, what are the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So if your analysis is deep, is more analytical, versus if it is shallow and descriptive, you can differentiate between the descriptive and analytical. Now, given this, where would you box cross-sectional study designs? Are these observational or experimental? They are observational. Where do you box the cross-section studies in terms of the analytical procedures? Are they descriptive or analytical? They are mainly descriptive, but somehow if your research question is more sophisticated, okay, then you can say you can answer some deep, thoughtful research questions, analytical questions. But at face value, yes, you are correct. Cross-sectional study design are described as being mainly observational and descriptive. Now, so if you want to box all or enumerate and list all the different types of study designs, and if you want to label them and describe them as being observations versus experimental, analytical versus descriptive, you can group all study designs into three major groups. One is observation and descriptive studies. Under this comes the ecological correlation studies, which are not part of this series, but under it also, this includes also the cross-section study design, which is the topic of this session. So cross-section study designs are observation and descriptive. Before going to the objectives, let's look at the other types of study designs. One, we have case control. I'm sure you have heard about the term case control. The other are cohort studies. Both the case control and cohort studies are described as being observational, but they are more analytical. Why more analytical? Because the research question we are trying to answer over here, we are trying to search for a certain cause. We are not just describing the distribution or the pattern of the disease or of the outcome by time, place, and place. The third major group or category is what? The experimental study. So if you go again to the objectives of the observational descriptors, what do you see in terms of the objectives? We are just starting to understand what are the patterns or the frequency and the distribution of our dependent variable by persons, time, and place only. So we are just trying to understand what is the distribution of obesity by gender, what's the distribution of obesity by socioeconomic status, the distribution of obesity by living conditions, by different personal characteristics, or how did obesity vary by time, the past few years, and where is obesity more prevalent? Is it prevalent in the rural areas versus the urban areas? Is it present in the mountainous areas versus at the coastal areas, and so on and so forth? So you are trying to answer basically three questions: the who, the where, and the when, the three WHO questions. In observation and analytical, okay, which includes the case control and cohort studies, we are here analyzing, meaning we are searching for a certain cause. Okay, given that the distribution of obesity is higher in males versus females or vice versa, why? So the question over here becomes, it's not how obesity is distributed by gender, but then the question is what? Why it is more prevalent in males versus females for Parkinson's. So I'm trying to answer here why, the question why, and you are trying to search for a cause, looking for determinants of disease and associations between exposure. The third group are experimental studies. I will not go into the details of this group, which include the experimental and the quasi-experimental. The question over here, or the main objective, is we are testing associations, we are testing interventions. Somehow, you can say you are testing the why, but through interventions. Okay, we are testing the association which you observe in the observational studies through interventions, and the main question over here, is it true what we have found in the observational studies apply equally well in the experimental studies? Clear? Any question? Please stop me if you have any comment, or you feel that we need to elaborate more on any theme or concept. So, in the hierarchy of the research evidence, in terms of, as we mentioned that there are different types of study designs, but the evidence produced from each study vary by the design itself. So, if you focus on the third or fourth row in this pyramid, you see, what do you see? Case control studies and cross-sectional surveys together. So although both are observational, yet one is more descriptive than the other, but towards the end, the evidence coming from the case control and the cross-section study is not as hardcore evidence as one can get from experimental studies, the randomized clinical trials. And hence, if you look into the literature, you will find that the majority of studies conducted or published in the literature are based on expert opinion, based on a case report or case series analysis, and then when you go towards the study design, which will give you a more rigorous evidence, you will see that the number or the quantity of publications becomes smaller and smaller as you go towards the top of the pyramid, which include the systematic reviews and the meta-analysis, in which the outcome over here, okay, the evidence coming from findings of systematic reviews and meta-analysis is stronger than that coming from anecdotal evidence or anecdotal studies or case reports and case series and cross-section. So the topic of this session is cross-sectional surveys. I'm not saying that the evidence coming out of them is of low quality. There is some kind of evidence. You have to believe in the findings, but your belief, your trust in the findings may not be as strong as your trust in the findings coming from RCTs, the randomized clinical trials, and the systematic reviews. Okay? So, now, as I mentioned earlier, there is no study design which is immune from biases. And the question then given, what design fits the research question? For each research question, you have to think about what's your independent variable, what's your dependent variable. You have to think about the potential sources of data for collecting the information on each of these variables, okay? And not only that, you have to think about the funding, the availability of resources. Yani, even if you would love to have a clinical trial or a rigorous methodology, study design, but you don't have enough funds, what you end up with doing what? A cross-section study. Even if you would like to have a sample of 1,000 individuals within your study, but you do not have funds for only 200, then you have to abide by this is limiting the type of the study start. So when you are thinking about which research study design is preferable, you have to think about the cost, okay, the dollar sign, tagged to your study, as well as your research question, and what's the most optimal source of data to answer that specific research question, and hence what is the most optimal design that fits with that research question. Okay, so as we discussed earlier, the research design to answer the specific question. For example, if my research question, what is the burden of cardiovascular disease in the community? What does it mean, the burden? It means the toll, okay? It means how prevalent it is. okay, then the most optimal cross-sectional study design would be what? The cross-sectional. Similarly for diagnostics, okay, if you are talking about diagnosis over here, for example, in screening, it is a typical cross-sectional studies. If you are after the course of the disease, the prognosis following the disease, what happens to the individual following the disease, so you want to follow individuals up. So this cannot be answered through a cross-sectional study design at one point in time. You need to follow individuals up to time, and hence the most optimal one will be cohort, and so on and so forth, without going into details of the other. But what I'm trying to highlight in this slide is that the research question dictates which study design you are at, which study design is most opportune to conduct for that specific research question. Okay. Now, if you are reading now backward, I'm now with this slide, instead of starting with the research question and identifying the study design, now I want you to look at a publishable paper, okay, and try to understand, try to define the study design in that specific paper. So which questions you ask yourself, and how do you go about it in this kind of an algorithm? The first thing you have to ask yourself, is the exposure or the intervention under the control of the researcher? What does it mean, the exposure under your control? And we intervene, okay? If this is yes, what type of study design is fair? If no, then it comes under the rubric of observational studies. The second question, are the subjects followed up over time? Okay, was there kind of a follow-up? If yes, it is what? A cohort study. If no, it is either a case control or a cross-sectional. So the third question, are the subjects selected based on the outcome of interest? Yani when we designed the study and we started to select our population, did we start by cases versus control, or did we select randomly population irrespective of their disease status? If yes, then it's a case control. If not, then it is what? A cross-sectional study design. For example, if I want you, based on this statement, to tell me whether this, what study design is this, okay? A total of 1,000 individuals were interviewed regarding their current status of height and weight, as well as their socioeconomic status. What is this? 1,000 individuals. What is this? Cross-sectional study. Why? Because I'm starting with 1,000 individuals without tagging to this number any characteristic, okay? And I'm asking them about some kind of characteristics. Now, if I'm telling you, I'm starting with 1,000 obese individuals and 1,000 non-obese individuals and asking them about their lifestyle activities or physical activity. What is this? It's okay. Why? Because I'm starting with cases versus control, asking about exposure. Okay. I'm starting with 1,000 individuals free from the outcome of interest, and I have followed these individuals up with time. This is cohort. Or I'm starting with 1,000 individuals who are obese, and I've distributed them into two groups, one in which I intervened and allocated a certain physical activity regimen, and the others were removed as control. This is what a clinical or randomized clinic. Fine. So let's come to cross-section studies. Are these prevalence or incidence? I know that to start with, my first slide said that cross-section studies are what? Prevalence. And we try to understand why are these prevalence and not incidence studies. So what do you see over here? You see a pot, okay, in which you have the first figure to your left, you see a pot in which you have the total burden of the disease in that pot, and this is referred to as what? Prevalence. How do we add incidence, or how do we add more cases to the prevalence? How do we increase the burden of the disease? How do we increase the total number of cases found in the community? You can increase it by two ways. You increase it by having new cases coming to the community, new cases. So new cases referred to as what? Incident cases. And you can increase the prevalence by blocking this tube towards the end, blocking the death and the cure. So if I'm talking about diabetes, for example, which does not usually, diabetic persons, diabetes does not have a high case fatality rate, and it does not have a cure. It has a treatment, but one who is succumbed with diabetes usually have a long life, but being labeled as having diabetes needs treatment, management, okay, management, but the person will never be cured. So what happens to the diabetes in the community? We are always adding to the community new cases, and we are blocking the output from below. We are blocking the death and the cure. So what happens to the prevalence of diabetes in the community? Shall we see here? Thanks. Let me ask you another question. If I'm talking here about, for example, pancreatic cancer, okay? What about the incidence of pancreatic cancer in the community? Is it high or is it low? Pancreatic cancer, is it a rare disease or is it a prevalent disease? Rare disease, okay? So we're talking about the TAP, the new incidence, as being what? First, it is small, the TAP, okay, the TAP of water coming from top is small, and not only that, let's look and examine the pancreatic cancer in terms of death and cure. Do you know what's the case fatality, or do you know what's the life expectancy of an individual who have been diagnosed with liver cancer or pancreatic cancer? Small. It's very short. So what happens to the tube below? شو بيصير عنا؟ يلي بفوت من فوق شو بيعمل؟ بيطلع direct. So what happens to the prevalence of pancreatic cancer? It decreases. If you were a public health person, when I say a public health person, if you were in the shoes of the Director General of our Ministry of Public Health, Dr. Walid Ammar, would you be more concerned about pancreatic cancer or diabetes in the community? Why? Because I want to spend money on patients on a highly prevalent disease like diabetes, because people who are succumbed with diabetes have a long life and I need to support them for life. Okay? So I don't worry about what the other cancer or the other type of disease which has a low incidence, particularly that, not only because it has a low incidence compared to diabetes, but only also because it gets depleted from the community because of that. I would be very happy to have cures, people depleted from the community because of cures, but rarely we have diseases, I'm talking about chronic diseases, which go out into cure. Definitely we are happy with infectious diseases. Why? Because, not happy, but I'm talking why infectious diseases may not be as prevalent as the chronic diseases, okay, only because although you may have higher proportion of incident cases, but what happens towards the end?
More cure.
This is a very general statement. Please don't quote me over this. We have so many emerging diseases which are, although they are infectious in nature, but they are chronic in time. Okay, they stay with us for a long period of time. Let alone, for example, one specific example is what?
HIV.
Okay, I'm not sure about the Ebola. What's the case fatality of Ebola
very
over
high.
here? It's
More than 70%.
So it goes, but the problem, although with Ebola it's an infectious disease and they might not be prevalent, but the problem with Ebola is what the infectivity of the disease. So we get to have more cases prevalent only because I'm talking here about an infectious disease in which you have more people becoming prevalent, not because of only incident cases, but incident cases and host cases becoming infected because of that. So I hope that now you understand that prevalence is not incidence, and a disease with a high prevalence, like diabetes, okay, does not necessarily mean that it has a high incidence, okay? It only could reflect what? Increased survival, like diabetes, for example, improved care and long duration. And an outcome with a low prevalence does not necessarily mean low incidence. So when you look into the distribution of disease based on cross-sectional studies in which the outcome is prevalence, this will not give us any indication about incidence. It will give us only indications about what? Prevalence in the community. Because prevalence is not necessarily equal to, or it does not necessarily correlate with incidence. Sorry, prevalence does not correlate with Again, prevalence is a function, as we mentioned, prevalence is a function of both incidence and the duration of the disease. For example, common diseases like the head lice can have moderate or low prevalence. Why? Because the duration is short. So it gets depleted from the community because of short duration. Or diseases with very low incidence such as diabetes have relatively high prevalence because the duration is long and there is no cure from diabetes. Okay, questions. We'll stop here for a couple of questions to see where are we. The number of persons living with diabetes in your community as of December 31, 2011. Are we measuring prevalence or incidence here? The number of persons diagnosed with breast cancer in your community during 2011. Incidence or incidence? What are the keywords or what are the triggers that helped you to identify and differentiate between the first statement as being prevalence and the next statement as being incidence?
As of during.
Not necessarily. Actually, I made it much more simpler to
Living
you.
with
diagnosis.
Much simpler. The terms highlighted in red, living and diagnosed. كلمة diagnosed يا جماعة، شو يعني the word diagnosed؟ When you say I have been diagnosed، شو معناته؟ يعني new, I'm a new case. Or the number of persons who developed breast cancer. What is this? The words should be indicative of whether we are talking about incidence. It's not the duration, because you can still have in the first statement the number of persons living with diabetes during the year 2011. During. It's not the during. We differentiate over there between point prevalence and period prevalence. Okay, don't want to go into details of this, hoping that in the next session Dr. Shaya will be talking more, discussing more of this. But it is not as of or during, it's a matter of fact the words living and diagnosed, okay, that differentiate between it. Okay, you conducted a survey of 450 households where 1,000 adults between age 30 and 60 were asked the following question. Do you currently have high blood pressure? And 80 said yes. What is this? Well, during the past 2 years, have you ever had high blood pressure? Have you ever had high pressure? Do you? The key, I told you earlier, the key to differentiate between incidence and prevalence is what? Is to see whether you can understand from this question that the 100 cases are new cases. Let me go back to the first question. Do you currently have high blood pressure? And 80 said yes out of 1,000 individuals. Can you differentiate whether these 80, what's the time frame when they develop the 80? If you cannot differentiate the time frame, okay, then it is what? Prevalence. During the past 2 years, have you ever had high blood pressure? So 100 cases said yes, during the past 2 years, I've had some symptoms of high blood pressure. Do I know when they developed the disease, when they were diagnosed, whether they were diagnosed before the 2 years, or during the 2 years, or when during the 2 years? We don't know anything about the timing of the cases. So here we are talking about prevalence. How many of the cases were cases which developed, diagnosed during the past year? Now, yes, 30 cases, I know the time frame. Once you can tag a time frame to your number, okay, exact time frame when they were developed, when the cases became new cases, then it is what? Clear? No. So again and again and again, cross-sectional studies are what? Oh. Now given this, let's come to the main limitation of cross-sectional studies. Here is an example. A cross-sectional survey of coronary heart disease among male farm owners aged 40 to 74 years by occupational activity. So if you look at the title of this table, before going into the details and the numbers within this table, first we understand that the design of this study is what? Cross-section. I want you to identify for me what is the main exposure variable. Farm owners, okay, by occupational, so it's coronary heart disease by occupational activity. So what's the main exposure or independent variable, and what's the main outcome or dependent variable? What's the main dependent variable? Dependent. What does it mean, dependent? Outcome. Okay, so it is what? The dependent is coronary heart disease. What's the main independent variable? It is what? Occupational activity. Remember your high school. تتذكروا الإكس والواي ولا لا؟ We used, what does it mean? Is the X dependent on the Y, or is Y dependent on X? Y is dependent on X. X is the independent. We can نحط على X axis ونقول ال X axis if you increase, for example, the number of study Okay. What happens to your scholastic achievement? It increases. So what's the independent variable? It is the number of hours of study. What is your outcome? It is what? The achievement. So X is the independent variable and Y is the dependent. Over here in the title, what is the outcome? Coronary heart disease. It is dependent on occupational activity. Okay, so occupational activity becomes the independent. It's not dependent on anything. For me, it's a variable. It's not dependent, and the occupational activity impacts on coronary heart disease. Okay. Now we surveyed in this study. This is a hypothetical study. We surveyed the number of examined. You see in the second column. What's the number examined over here? 175. A total of 179 individuals were examined. Based on this cross-section study, meaning that we asked the 179 individuals about their physical activity and about their coronary heart disease status. Clear? So we asked the 179, how often are you physically active? Yes and no. Fine, no and yes. And we asked them, do you currently have cardiovascular disease? Some yes said yes and others said. So out of the 179, okay, how many said yes, I have coronary heart disease? 17. Okay. So what's the prevalence rate over here? How do you calculate the prevalence? It is 17 divided by 179. Times a certain constant factor 1000, بيطلع عنا 95 per 1000. Meaning that if you select randomly 1000 males in the age group 40 to 74, the likelihood of finding cases of coronary heart disease is estimated by what? 95 individuals. Similarly, if you select randomly 179, the likelihood of finding a coronary heart disease is 17. يعني 17 على 79 مثل 95 على 1000. Now, we asked these 179 about their physical activity. How many said yes, we are physically active? 90. So what's the prevalence of, please remember, focus on my question, sorry. I'm talking now, what's the prevalence of physical activity in the sample? Ignore this column. The prevalence of physical activity in the sample? 90 over 179. But this is a crude measure. 90 over 179 is a crude measure. And 17 over 179 is a crude measure with no regard to each other. يعني أخذت الفيزيكال activity لحالها شو البريفالنس وأخذت الكوروناري heart disease شو البريفالنس without trying to associate both together. In order for me to associate them both together, I need to look at the raw percentages. Okay, so out of 89 who were not physically active, how many have the disease? 40. So what's the prevalence rate? 160. Okay, كيف جبنا 160? Yes, 14 divided by 80. Out of 90 who are physically active, okay, 3 said yes, they have disease. So what's the prevalence of coronary heart, what's the, number of coronary disease. What's the prevalence of coronary heart disease among those who are physically active? 3 divided by 90 times 1000 is 33 per 1. So now we have two rates. صح؟ واحدة among the not physically active and the other among those who are physically active from a typical cross-sectional study. Now just eyeballing these two percentages, يعني eyeballing طلع عليها اللي ما بيعرف شيء أكلي ولا بيعرف شيء math ولا بيعرف شيء. Just look يعني if you give it to a high school student, تقولي له the prevalence rate of coronary heart disease among those who are not physically active is 160 per 1000 and the prevalence rate among those who are physically active is 33 per 1000. What do you notice? What conclusion can you make? It seems that, yes.
Patients who are not physically active are more prone to
Yes, it looks like those who are not physically active or are more prone to coronary heart disease, or vice versa, those who are physically active are less prone. So just eyeballing these two percentages, the relationship between physical activity and coronary heart disease is somehow protective, meaning that those who are physically active are protected to succumb to have coronary heart disease. Can you think about the limitation over here, about our conclusion? Yes, but can you elaborate on this, please? The relationship, sorry? Is not clear, yes. In what sense it is not clear?
Maybe other factors may contribute.
Okay, in all studies there are other factors, and there is sampling issues and confounding issues and p-values and significance. But specifically, before going into this, specifically for this type of cross-sectional study design, and our colleague over here is telling us that the relationship is not clear about which is the dependent and which is the independent. نحن قلنا من التايتل إنه yes, the independent variable is occupational activity, the dependent is coronary heart disease. That's fine, this is our hypothesis. لأنه ما معقول نقول coronary heart disease affects physical activity. Or is it logical to say this or not?
Yes.
Yes, who said yes?
Bias.
Biased response. Yes. نحن we hypothesized at the outset that it is occupational activity will lead to what? Coronary heart disease. And as a matter of fact, I led you into that. Okay? Someone should have been brave enough and tell me, why am I supposing that occupational activity leads to coronary heart disease? Isn't that the case also that if I have coronary heart disease, what happens to my physical activity? It will get decreases. Only because, not because physical activity أثرت على القلب تاعي، صار معي قلب because of family history because هذا، وأنا لما صار معي قلب بطلت شو أقدر أتحرك وأروح أكون active in the farm وأشتغل occupational activity. Now I'm talking about occupational activity, they need to be farmers working. So what's the main limitation of the cross-section study? We don't know which one first. Yes, we see that now. It's exactly like when we say in the later شو هو مثلا بيضاوي مين إجا قبل ما بنعرف مين إجا قبل. This is the main limitation of cross-section study. It's very difficult to identify whether in this specific case it is physical activity leading to protection against coronary heart disease, or is it because you have coronary heart disease you cannot do this. In most research questions this could be the case, but it's not always the case. By the way, if I'm asking you, what about the relationship between coronary heart disease and education? Do you have this problem over here that we don't know which came first? Why and why not? Not necessarily. Education is accrued at the age of 20. When you're 20, صح؟ بتوقفوا education هنيك بنعرف at the age of 20s, during your 20s, you accrue, you finalize your education. You are high school, you are in middle school, you are a kindergarten and you have not continued, but you are a PhD and a medical doctor or a nurse or whatever, صح? And you have coronary heart disease usually in your mid-age, okay? So if I'm studying this relationship, even if it's a cross-section study, I'm looking at socioeconomic status operationalized by education and coronary heart disease, even in a cross-section study, is this a problematic? Is the issue of time between precedence between the exposure and outcome, is it an issue over here? It's not necessarily an issue over here. It's an issue in this specific example because I'm talking about an exposure and an outcome which might have occurred concurrently. So we don't know which way. 2. Be more elaborate on the issue of the limitation of the cross-sectional study. I'm presenting here to you a kind of a scenario of 2 jobs. One is job A, which is hazardous, and job B is non-hazardous, and you have 100 workers here and 100 workers here. If you look at the data for the hazardous job, what do you find? 20 are ill here and 80 in the non-hazardous job, 5 are ill and 95 well, meaning that you have a lower prevalence here than in the hazardous job. If you are conducting a cross-section study at time 1 over here, what would be your conclusion? Look at the prevalence rate of the disease, the illness, in job A. How do you calculate this one? 20 divided by 100, so it's 20%. What about the prevalence here?
5%.
Let's compare these two. Okay, you know nothing about risk ratio, odds ratio, anything, but let's compare these two, 20 and 5%. Yes, the likelihood of having a disease among workers in job A is higher, or we can say 4 times more. Kishani 4 times more, we divide the 20 by 5. 4 times more than job A. Fine? Now, these 20 ill people, they have been, 10 of them have been seriously ill. شو صار فيهم؟ They left their job because of the disease. ما عرفنا بعد شو عملوا هون, but so far all we know that they left job. If you were conducting research or conducting your survey at time 2, let's see what happened. So you still have the 80 here, 10 have left and you are left with 10 who are ill. You have 95 and 5. Let's calculate now the prevalence rate. So it's 10 divided by a dish 90. 10 plus 80, 90, صح? It's 11%. What about this one? This one is still the same. Nothing has happened with this cohort. It was put in the two time periods. It is 5 divided by 100, so it's 5%. What do you know? You still have a higher rate here, but it is not as acute. The difference is not as grave as it was in the first time. So if you were conducting your cross-section study at time 1, you still have, you conclude that job A is hazardous, but 4 times more hazardous. Whereas at time 2, this is hazardous, but what's the differential between the jobs? It's only 2 points. So the conclusion is different. في فرق كتير بين الأربعة و 2.2. And believe me, you will understand towards the end of this series of lectures that there's a big difference between 4 and 2. Let me present the same scenario but in a different way. Now, هالعشرة, these 10 individuals who left their job here, شو عملوا؟ فاتوا على job which is easier for them, which is not hazardous. Here maybe there is a lot of strenuous activity in job A. هذيك more administrative, so what did they do? They came and changed their job. Okay. Let's do the calculations now. هون ما تغير شيء at time 1. Let's see what happened at time 2. So here what do you have? 10 divided by 90, it's 11%, صح? Here the 10 individuals who were ill here changed their job and to become as part of the workforce in job B. So you have how many ill now? 15 ill. Assuming no death has occurred, this is a stable population. What's the prevalence rate of the disease in job B?
14.
It is 15 divided by 110. It's 14%. 11 divided by 14%. What happens now to your conclusion? More. Can I the conclusion? This one is 4 times worse than this one. What happens now to the conclusion here? This one is even better. It's even better. So it's not only like in the first slide that the conclusion بعده مقبول. In both cases the job A is hazardous and only the differential between job A and B has been attenuated or reduced. Here totally the conclusion has been what? Inverted.
In such studies, we should ask the workers, the duration of their work.
Definitely,
They change
yes.
their work.
But then in a cross-section study, what happens if you want to go and ask each and every individual about their life history? Then it becomes very problematic, and then it might not be easy to do a cross-section study. You are better off to conduct a case control study.
Or just at least for the job, not only the lifestyle.
Now we are talking about the job. If you in any study you don't investigate only one specific exposure. What about smoking? Someone who has been a smoker at time 1, okay, became an ex-smoker at time 2. Do you know in cross-section study what's the relationship between smoking and coronary heart disease? Which category has the highest odds ratio or risk ratio? Is it the non-smoker? Is it the ex-smoker? Or is it the current smoker? Which has the highest prevalence of coronary heart disease in cross-section study?
Ex-smoker?
Yes.
Why? They cannot smoke anymore.
They cannot smoke anymore because they became disease. Okay, they had the incidence of the disease and then they became non-smoker. مش إنه صاروا non-smoker على صحة
So
وسلامة.
we cannot join the ex-smoker with the non-smoker.
I'm not saying here to no. I'm not talking. I never insinuated in cross-section study you join X and current. All I'm trying to say in cross-section study, your conclusion that quitting smoking is bad to your health is not correct, because at face value, the prevalence of coronary heart disease among ex-smokers would be higher than even that among smokers. So you may end up in the conclusion that don't quit smoking because you will have a higher rate of health. So if you want to go in any cross-section study and you can start about physical activity and what happened across your lifetime, smoking, what happened to you across a lifetime, then it becomes problematic. It's no more a cross-section study. It's a cross-section study with lots of retrospective data and becomes truly problematic. Okay. That's why I'm telling you that if you truly believe that the exposure has happened way behind the outcome, it's not problematic. For example, genetic diseases. I'm asking about family history of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease in a cross-section study. Do you think the issue of time time precedence between the exposure is a problem over here. Family history شو يعني family history؟ عم بسأل شخص والدتك أو بيك okay أو anyone in the family who has مثلا died before the age of this. So this has happened before. It's genetic. It comes, you know, it has been produced while this individuals while in the embryo of the mother. So it has the exposure has happened much earlier, and it's not it. All I'm trying to highlight over here, you have to be very careful about interpreting the data from cross-sectional study, particularly because of this. We refer to this problem as reverse causality. شو يعني reverse causality؟ يعني the causation between the exposure and the outcome, okay, because may be in either way, okay, reverse. Okay, it could be that the X leading to the Y or the Y. I hope that I had explained this point quite well and you are convinced about it, that cross-section studies are limited by reverse causality. Okay, so to summarize, the outcome and exposure are measured at one point in time. That's why it's called, it's a cross-sectional, it's a snapshot. It's similar when you are talking, you are having one piece of the cake. What happens when you're having one piece of the cake? You are seeing only one part of the cake. You don't know about the other parts, okay? We are viewing a snapshot of the population at a certain point in time, issue of temporality, reverse causality. What is the other limitation in cross-section studies? It's not suitable for rare diseases. For example, if I want to look at risk factors for HIV, then probably you need 500,000 individuals, okay, cross-section of 500,000 individuals to come up maybe with 200 cases of HIV. I'm talking here in the non-high risk population, the general population. Excuse me. So it's not suitable for rare diseases or diseases of short duration. For example, lice among students, okay? It's good to look at lice among students, but because it's a short duration, okay, sometimes you are missing on the number of new cases and old cases and the permanent cases because they tend to be quickly acute. Yet, in spite of these limitations, cross-section studies are the source of most of what we know about the population. Excuse me. We know from cross-sectional studies about the burden of the disease, we know about the prevalence of risk factors, we know about attitudes, perceptions, beliefs, we know about utilization of health services, and definitely cross-sectional studies are important to generate hypotheses. We do not test hypotheses, we just see the distribution of the disease by time, place, and persons, and because of this kind of analysis, we are generating hypotheses. It's similar to the question between physical or the data between physical activity and coronary heart disease. We just found out that there could be an association. We are generating a hypothesis that physical activity is associated with coronary heart disease, but if you want to test it with more rigorous methodology because of the limitations, then you need to conduct case control or reports or documentation. So, now, sometimes cross-section studies are referred to as surveys, okay? And for me, they are the same. Some people like to differentiate between surveys and cross-section studies. Okay? But surveys in general are referred to as cross-section studies, and you have quite often the majority of us work or have conducted small-scale surveys. Why? Because they are easy to conduct. Most of the students trying to learn research methods, going into a master's degree, or they don't have the time, they don't have the resources, they do what? Cross-section study. But if you really are going into a PhD, cross-section study may not be the proper design to conduct it. Some of our students have conducted, through their even master, they have conducted analytical study designs like the case control study. But quite often it is the small-scale surveys which are more common in the literature. So if you Google the literature regarding any research questions, you will find that the majority are based on the cross-section studies. Now, national cross-section studies and small-scale. What does it mean small-scale? Meaning in a localized community, small sample, not necessarily looking at the general national samples. Okay. In Lebanon, we have had the opportunity to get some data at the national level. These are referred to as national surveys. The first one I would like to highlight is the PHS survey, the Population and Housing Survey conducted by the Ministry of Social Affairs in Lebanon in 1997. And I would consider this as a mini census for all the remaining studies conducted in Lebanon. You know that in Lebanon we are limited by the fact that we haven't had a census since, do you know when was the last census in Lebanon? 1932. The last census, if I'm not mistaken, it may be 1933, but as I recall, it's 1932. At maximum, best is 1932. So we haven't had a census. This creates a lot of problem in sampling, creates a problem in estimates at the national level, and not only that, as well, we are conducting national survey. So following the war in Lebanon between 1975 and 1990, the Ministry of Social Affairs thought that we need to come up with a kind of a mini census in Lebanon, and hence this PHS survey conducted by NOSA was considered as a mini census because it included 10% of the population. 10% of the population يعني هو فيها تقريبا 350,000 subjects were included in this survey. Then, following this, some other surveys have been conducted by the ministry and the ministerial unit, the CAS, the Center for Administrative Statistics in Lebanon, 2004, 2007. And I'm just highlighting these two لأنه هو اللي بلشوا فيهم بالأول, okay? But we are having now many more surveys at the national level conducted by the CAS, Living Condition Surveys in Lebanon. The most recent one conducted at the national level is the one on NCD Risk Factor Survey and Nutrition conducted by the AUB, the Faculty of Health Sciences, as well as FAS. Okay, I will not go into this, you don't need, I think, to go into this. Let me go to the design and analysis for the sake of it. Okay, do you have any comment, any question? Design and analysis. Let's start with the design. Okay. The basics of cross-sectional studies. You have a target population. You need to choose a target population. While I'm going, walking with you through this slide and the other slides, I just want to put us this slide in context of a specific research question. For example, what is the prevalence of obesity among AUB students, okay, by gender? So what is my outcome? Obesity. What's the main independent variable now? By gender, it is what? Male and female. Okay. What's the target population? I'm talking about university students in general. So what's my target population? It is all university students in Lebanon. Can we conduct a study in which we have collected data or sampled all the university students? No, we need to just have a small sample. So you choose a target population, in this case is what? University students. You assemble a sample, you start to do your sampling. Okay, what would be your sampling? It has to be a rigorous sample. I'm sure you have had the chance to discuss sampling, but anyway, sampling means because you cannot target or you cannot collect data on all the population, you need to have a random sample by which you would say that this sample is representative of the target population. So based on the resources you have, based on the time, based on the money, dollars you have, you start to choose, okay, I will choose University X, Y, Z from the public sector, I will choose University A, B, C from the private sector. And not only that, within the university, I'll choose so many number of students, okay, so you have multi-level kind of sample. Anyway, you assemble the sample, and what's next? You need to develop a valid survey instrument, the questionnaire, okay? The questionnaire could be structured or could be semi-structured questionnaires, could be quantitative, could be qualitative, depending on what are the objectives of your study. And you start to collect the data and administer the survey. There are different modalities over here. You can do the collection of data through social media, through emails, through WhatsApp, through whatever. You can do it by email, you can do it by as self-administered, you can do it face-to-face interviews. So you have different ways and modalities of collecting the data that's within the questionnaire. This is not the objective of this session. I'm sure you'll have a chance to discuss more or to read more about the sampling methods, the different modalities of administering the question, and then you start to analyze the data to come up with it. Let's briefly take few minutes, okay, for each of these specific steps. let's define the population and the sample. Defining the target population, you need to identify what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Am I interested in senior or junior or sophomore students, masters or undergrad, PhD or all students? So these are the type of inclusion and exclusion. Am I interested in students who are above 30 years of age, or shall I limit it to a certain age? Am I interested in both genders, and so on and so forth? So you have to think about what's the inclusion and the exclusion criteria, and then you have to think about the sampling frame. What are the registers? What are the lists? The telephone directories, the emails, for example, the PO box if you have a PO box at the university. An inadequate sampling frame can result in bias in the results. Yeah, and you are a group of students of 20 in this class, okay? If I want to choose, and out of these 20, I have 10, let's assume out of 20 individuals in certain class, I have 10 males, okay? And I want to choose 6 individuals from the 20. If my sample is truly random, then the 6 from this community should include how many males? 3 males and 3 females, because the 3 males and 3 females will represent the target population. You need to have your sample representing the target population. You select the sample based on probability sampling using different types of sampling designs in order to get a good representative sample, which is very important for what we refer to as external validity. And external validity, generalizability of the results. In order to have my sample generalizable, it means that my sample, to start with, my sample should be representative of the target population.
It shouldn't be proportional to the
Yes, exactly.
ratio of male and
Yes,
female
exactly. In the target population, exactly. That's what
half.
happens.
So
If it's half, then and your sample is 6 individuals, then you should end up with 3 males and 3 females.
if it is a 2/3, 1/3,
It should be a new sample should be proportionate to the distribution of these specific characteristics in the target population. Okay. Now, what are the potential biases with sampling? And in the inadequate sampling frame, which is a problem also in most of our studies which we conduct in the community, because we don't have up-to-date listing of so many target populations we are interested in. Even the population, as I mentioned, even if we want to conduct a household face-to-face interviews, we don't have a census. We don't know what's the distribution of the population in each qada. We don't know the distribution of the population in each locality. So it's very difficult to get a good random sample. Not only that, assume that you have a good listing of the population and you have targeted a good random sample. There is selection bias in cross-section studies. As a matter of fact, selection bias can occur in any study design. Okay? What does it mean, selection bias? Yani, I'm sampling you. You have been targeted to be part of my sample, and I come to you, I need to have your consent. I ask you, I am Amla Sibai, I conducted a study looking at the relationship between X and Y. Do you agree to be part of the study? This questionnaire will take only 10 minutes of your time. Okay? If you say no, and so many of your colleagues say no, what is this? This will affect what? The selection. Okay? This will end in some kind of selection bias. When you have a high proportion of individuals who refuse to be part of your study, cross-section study, this will affect the external validity of your study. The third potential bias in cross-section study is insufficient sample size. You want to have, for example, based on rigorous methodology, you want to have 100, but you end up having 60. This is what? An insufficient sample size, and this will bring us to the sample size calculation. For any study, there should be a formula, okay, by which you are able to estimate the optimal sample size that will give you, okay, a rigorous finding for the research question you are trying to ask. And without going into the details of the sample size, the details of the sample size calculation, I need you to understand that the sample size calculation, the formula is dependent on several parameters. How many of you have been introduced to the Z of the alpha, Z of alpha, for example? Okay, so I will not go into the details of this, but I will go over it quickly over here because this may not be the focus also of this session. But what I want to highlight from this formula is that the samples, before you conduct any study, you need to have a statistician beside you in order to estimate for you based on rigorous methods and rigorous formula, the optimal sample size for establishing an evidence or establishing the findings of your research question. If you wish to have a very small margin of error in your estimate, then definitely your sample size need to be larger. This is the only message maybe you need to take from this slide. Without going into this. I think I will skip over here because it becomes problematic to go over Mahek, Dr. Ramona, because then
They lack the
this is,
background.
this is not.
If they understand that calculating a sample size is necessary for every study, that's
Yes,
enough.
That's it.
And you're not expected to know how to generate it yourself, but the message is go consult somebody who can help you. Okay?
Okay, now, so you have identified your target population, you have selected your sample hoping that you don't have a lot of non-response over here, you have identified the sample size or sample size determination. Now we go to the team to do what? The data collection. The data collection can take different modes. It could be face-to-face, it could be phone interviews, it could be self-administered. The sources of the data collection could be objective based on lab tests, it could be subjective based on interviews. The variables which you need to include in your questionnaire, you have to think with your collaborators about how do you want to operationalize your concepts. For example, if your outcome is mental health, then you need to understand or you need to evaluate and agree among yourselves as collaborators, as principal investigators, what exactly in mental health we are after. ما فينا نروح نسأل الزلمة عندك مرض ذهني. No, we have to be very careful about what exactly in mental health we are after. Are we after depression? Are we after some kind of psychotic characteristics and so on and so forth? And for each of these outcomes, you need to sit together and look into the literature. How do we measure this specific outcome? So the coming up with a questionnaire is not as quick and as easy that one might think about. Okay, so you have to think about it. So you collect the data, okay, and now you have to come with, you have to start analyzing the data and seeing is there a relationship between the exposure and the outcome. So you have the target population, you have the sample, you have the data on exposure and outcome, and now you can group your individuals into 4 mutually exclusive cells or groups. Those who have the outcome and are exposed, those who have the outcome and non-exposed, or those who do not have the outcome and are exposed, and those who do not have the outcome and are not exposed. To put this into perspective, we can group them into 2x2 tables. Usually, it is متعارف عليه يعني well agreed upon investigators that we like to have the outcome as a column variable and the exposure as a row variable. Okay? And now, our study sample, هون ال grand total study sample can be categorized into 4 groups. A, in which you have the exposure and the outcome present. D, in which you have neither present, neither the outcome nor the exposure. B, in which you have the outcome absent but the exposure present. And C, in which you have the outcome present but the exposure absent. And you do some calculations. Let's look at examples and calculations. In this example, I'm trying to look at the relationship between alcohol consumption and gender among university students. Okay? So what's the outcome? It's heavy alcohol. What's the exposure? It is what? Male and female. Let's look at this example. What's the total sample size? 100. How many are alcohol users? 30. So what's the prevalence of heavy or abused heavy alcohol? 30 divided by 100. How many are males in this sample? 20%. Fine. Am I interested in 20%? No. Am I interested in 30% only? No. I'm interested to look at the prevalence of alcohol use in the 2 categories of gender, male and female. What is the prevalence of alcohol among males? It's 10 divided by 20. What's the prevalence among females? It's 20 divided by 8. So if you look at these percentages, 50 and 25, what do you notice? Males, yes, are more likely to be abusing or using heavy alcohol consumption than females. Fine. So the proportion, we refer to this proportion of abuse among males is 50%, proportion of abuse among females is 25%. Now, I want to see how do we conduct the analysis in a cross-sectional studies. One way is to look at the percentages as such. نقسمهم على بعض بيطلع عنا prevalence ratio 50 to 25%. But quite often in cross-sectional studies we like to use the odds ratio. And let's see what do we mean by the odds ratio and how do we calculate the odds ratio. Okay? Let's look at the odds over. Now, I want you to differentiate between probability and odds. كلمة probability meaning it's A over A plus B. يعني there is a numerator and the denominator, it includes the numerator. So what's the probability or what's the prevalence of men in this room? 1, 2, 3 out of 15. This is probability or this is prevalence. Huh? If I want to look at odds, it means it's A over B. It's no more, not anymore A over A plus B. So what's the odds of having a male in this room? If the probability is 3 out of 15, what is the odds? It's 3 out of 12. You see that? Okay, again. So if the probability of having a male in this room is 10%, meaning 10 out of 100, what is the odds? 10 out of 90. You see the difference between. If the odds is 3 out of 5, 3 males, which out of 5? 3 to 5, 3 males to 5 females. What is the probability?
3 over 8.
Over 8.
So clear, we are all on the same page regarding the differences between prevalence or probability and odds. Okay. Now given this, I want to do some calculations here based on the handout or based on the data before. If this is the prevalence, 10 divided by 20, 20 divided, what is the odds here? 10 divided by 10. What is the odds here? 20 divided by 60. So we have now the odds of being an abuser of alcohol or a heavy drinker of alcohol among males versus the odds of being an abuser or heavy drinker among females. If you divide these two odds by each other, what do you have? You have the odds ratio. So the male to female odds is 25 divided by 75. The female to female odds is 75 divided by 25. Okay? So let's go back to this. If this is the odds, it is A divided by B. So, and the odds, this is among in the first row, and the odds in the second row is C divided by D. And simple manipulation of A divided by D divided by C over D should يطلع عنا AD divided by DC. So it's what? It's actually simpler than what I've explained. It's only a cross multiplication of the of the numbers in the two bipartites. Clear? Starting with A, and A being what? Those who are exposed and diseased. So let's apply this in our sample. So what's the odds of alcohol by gender? It is 10 divided by 10. Or 20 divided by 60. What's the odds ratio? It is 1 divided by 0.33 and you get a 3. Or simply 10 times 60 divided by 10 times 12. Fine? So it's a cross multiplication. Whether this or this way, it's 3. How do we interpret 3? It's the same thing like we interpret the prevalence rate ratio. It is what? Meaning that males are 3 times more likely to be abusing alcohol than females. Clear? Let's take this example. How do you calculate the odds here? 4, this is another example with different numbers. 4 times 63 divided by 16 over 16. Or 4 divided by 16 and 16 divided by 64. What do you notice? What's the odds ratio? 1. What does it mean now?
It's similar.
Equally, as likely. So is gender associated with alcohol abuse? No, because they are equally likely. Let's take a third example now. The odds is 4 over 16, 20 over 60. And you divide them by each other, it's 0.75. What does it mean?
Female are more abused.
Female are more likely, 0.33 is larger than 0.25, or 0.25 0.25 is less than 0.33. All gains are less
Slight.
than. So you have now three systems. One in which the odds ratio is larger than 1. Right? The other is where the odds ratio is equal to 1. And the third where the odds ratio is what? Less than. So 3 means that the odds of alcohol abuse is 3 times in males is 3 times the odds of abuse in females. 1 means the odds of alcohol abuse among males is similar to that in females. 0.75 means that the odds of alcohol abuse among males, is 0.75 times the odds of abuse. In this case, we refer to alcohol abuse as being a risk factor for
Males.
this one, no association. This one is protective factor. So to
The
summarize,
gender is a risk
here
factor.
I'm repeating in this in a new way. To summarize in this figure, you have a continuum over here. And what would be the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis, there is no association between X and Y, between the exposure and the outcome. When you see an odds ratio which is very close to 1, it's never equal to 1 يا جماعة. Okay, ما في حدا بياخد مني على مني. It's never, it could be equal to 1, but rarely in the literature equal to 1. But when you see the odds ratio very close to 1 from either side, يعني 1.1, 1.02, 1.07, 1.12, or 0.98, 0.99, 0.965, okay, what do you think would be the association?
No.
When you see that the odds ratio is towards this side, you are talking about a risk factor. When you see an odds ratio on this side, you are talking about the factor. So, if I tell you that the odds ratio between smoking and cardiovascular disease is 2.8, then we are talking about risk factor. That cigarette is hazardous to our health. If I want to look at the relationship between physical activity and the outcome, most likely it would be what? 0.8 or 0.75 when you are talking about the protective. So one is a risk factor, the other is protective factor. And the closer the association to one, meaning that we are approaching the null hypothesis, no association. Okay, to summarize over here, cross-sectional study, identify what prevalent cases rather than incident cases. The main limitation of cross-sectional studies is that reverse causality, meaning that temporal relationship cannot be established. Temporal relation meaning that we cannot establish which came first. Cross-sectional studies are not analytical in the sense that you are testing hypotheses. It's suggestive of the hypothesis. It's suggestive of the risk factor, but you say that this risk factor causes the outcome or is causing. Causation cannot be established with the outcome in cross-sectional studies. Given these limitations, okay, we tend to rely more on cohort studies, case control, clinical trials to establish risk factors or ecological relationships and to answer the question why. And this is what you will be doing next time. And in the next sessions, we will be discussing with you case control studies, cohort studies, looking at the determinants of the disease and trying to answer the question. Thank you. I'll stop over here and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you.